Hello folks, welcome to Chapter 18, Open Economy, Macroeconomics Basic Concept. First of all is the introduction. So trade can make everyone better off. We already know that, right? If you cannot get benefits with trading, you are not going to trade with anyone. So trade can make everyone better off. That's one of the 10 principles we learned. In this chapter, we are going to learn the basic concept of international macroeconomics. The first is the trade balance, trade deficit, and the trade surplus. We are already familiar with this, right? For the trade balance, usually just net export equals to exports minus imports. Right, that's the trade balance. If there is a trade deficit, which means imports is bigger than exports, and net export is negative, that's the trade deficit. If for trade surpluses, which means exports is bigger than imports, in that case, NX, the net exports, is going to be bigger than zero. So that's the trade balance, and we already learned this part. And for the new materials in this chapter is the international flows of assets and the exchange rate. We are going to learn these two today. Basically, three of them today. Let's have a brief review about the closed economy. It's the economy that doesn't interact with other economies in the world. And the opposite is the open economy. Economy that interacts freely with other economies around the world. And what kind of interact, what kind of stuff buy and sell? First of all is buys and sells goods and services in the world product market. We kind of for the net export or exports, imports, we learned something about this one, right? We sell goods, we buy goods and services from other countries. But except the goods and services we can trade with other countries, we can also buy and sell capital assets such as stocks and bonds in the world financial markets. So, which means when we interact with other countries, except the goods and services we can trade, but also the stock and the bonds. We kind of mentioned that part before, like the direct investment and the portfolio investment, right? The flow of goods and services, exports, easy. Goods and services that produce the blah blah, and the imports for the net exports is the value of exports minus value of imports. Again, we learned this before. But again, this equation is very important. The exports minus imports. So since we already got familiar with this one, let's see some example questions to try to remember it better. So what do you think would happen to the US net exports if, such as Canada, experiences a recession? So what happens to the US next part? Again, the net export equals to export minus import. So for the first one, for A, if Canada experiences a recession, what happens to the US? Because US next part will fall due to the fall in Canadian consumers' purchasing power, right? Since they are experiencing a recession, they do not have enough income, so they are going to decrease their consumptions, which means not only the domestic consumption, but also import from other countries like the US. So if the US exports decrease, which means the net export will also decrease. EX decrease, so NX decrease. How about B? Well, in this part, since the US consumers prefer to buy domestic product, because for consumers we have a specific basket of goods, right? That's all what we need. The quantity is kind of fixed. If we want to buy more products made in the US, which means we are going to decrease the quantity of imports, right? So if the quantity of in B, if the imports is going to decrease, because we are going to buy more product in the United States, which means we are going to buy fewer stuff made in other countries. So imports is going to decrease, which means next export. So if this one is decreased, so net exports is. How about C? The relative price change. What will happen? If the price of Mexican goods is more expensive, which means for the US consumers prefer cheaper stuff, right? If the price in Mexico is expensive, which means the relative price in the US is going to be cheaper. So in that case, for the United States, Americans consumers are going to purchase more of cheaper stuff, which is the stuff in the United States. Which means the Americans or consumers are not going to buy more stuff in other countries, like in Mexico. So in this case, the imports is going to decrease because the price in the United States is getting cheaper, right? But for the other countries' consumers, the same. Since the product in the US is relatively cheaper, which means for other countries' people, they prefer to buy Americans' product. So, which means the exports of the US here is going to increase. So if exports increase and the imports decrease, which means the net exports is going to increase. Alright? So when you deal with these kind of questions, you should think about if some scenarios happens, what happens to the questions. In this question is the US net exports, right? What happens to the US consumers? What happens to the other countries' consumers? If the US exports is going to go up, go down, or if the imports of US consumers will go up or go down. If you figure out the change of these two terms, you can find out the result of net exports. Factors might influence a country's exports, imports, and net exports. There are some factors could be consumers' taste for foreign and domestic goods. Except the relative price, the taste is also determines lots of stuff like characteristics, right? The first is characteristics. Different consumers have different preferences. So if I like these characteristics, maybe I'd like to pay more amount of money for that product. The second and third one, prices of goods at homes and abroad and exchange rate with foreign currency trade for domestic currency. For both of these two, is kind of like a relative price. Such as the example questions we learned before, like the price compared with Mexico and America, right? People prefer cheaper stuff. If the relative price is cheaper, then no matter just the consumers in that country, but all consumers in the world prefer the cheaper price, are going to buy the product, which the price is cheaper. So for second and third one, that's determine the relative price, and the consumers prefer the cheaper stuff. Incomes of consumers at home and abroad. This relative, this usually means income. For richer countries, they prefer to buy more quantity of stuff, right? And usually the price usually are cheaper in poor countries, which means rich countries usually have more imports than poor countries. And the poor countries, they prefer export their stuff to richer countries. So incomes usually one determinant of the net exports. Transportation cost, this is the cost for trade. If the transportation cost increase, that will decrease the trade, right? Because when people or consumers considering the good or the relative price, the transportation cost is one cost. If the cost increase, of course, they are not going to buy a huge amount of this stuff because people prefer cheaper stuff. The transportation cost is one part of cost. If cost increase, no matter what kind of cost, this is just one part, which means the price will increase. If the price increase, then the relative price will increase. People will prefer cheaper stuff. The last one is the government policies. For this one, that's easier to understand, right? If the government prefer their citizens to trade with others, then the government are going to publish some good policies to encourage citizens to buy foreign stuff. On the other side, if the government prefer close the economy, then the government is going to enact some policies that forbidden their citizens to trade with others, and that will decrease the international trade. Again, this is really easy. The trade surplus, which means the exports is greater than imports. So export minus imports is bigger than zero. Net export is bigger than zero. That's the trade surplus. We talk about the trade, usually we talk about the goods and services. The countries sell more goods and services abroad than is best from other countries, and the deficit is the opposite. If the imports are greater than the exports, then export minus imports is smaller than zero. So this one is smaller. That's the trade deficit. And for trade balance, they should be equal to each other. So we learned this before. According to this chart, that's the US economy's increasing openness. So from 1960 to 1919, you can see the US imports and the US exports. We can see starting from around 1982, the imports and the exports are kind of different. Before this time, for the United States, I think imports and exports were kind of similar. So the net exports was kind of zero. But after 1982, the imports, of course, is bigger than export, which means the net exports is smaller than zero for the United States after 1982. So we can see the period here, from around 2000 to 2008, the gap is kind of the biggest, right? The export minus import is the largest negative number around this period, which means the net export for the United States in 2000s is kind of huge, and that's a huge trade deficit. But in 2008, we know that financial crisis happened during that time. We can see for import decreased a lot, which is easier to understand because during that period, 2008, lots of Americans lost their job or their homes, whatever, the financial crisis, their income decreases by a huge amount of value. and they do not have enough money, because income determines how many quantity of goods and services people want to buy, right? So if people's income decreased during that period, of course, Americans do not want to buy enough quantities of goods and services for in both domestic market and from other countries. So for the United States, the imports was decreasing, and the exports is kind of the same, because again, the financial crisis was not only happened in the United States, but also happened in other countries, which means the purchasing power from other countries' citizens or the foreigners decreased as well. So they didn't want to buy American stuff either. So the exports decreased as well in 2008 during the financial crisis. That's what we can learn or we can get from this table. This material is new stuff, and that's the main stuff we need to learn in chapter 18. The flow of financial resources, the net capital outflow, that's short form is NCO, net foreign investment, is equal to the purchases of foreign assets by domestic residents minus the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners. Here, I emphasize the assets because assets is different from the goods and services. When we talk about trade, we talk about the goods and services we buy from other countries or you sell to other countries. But when we talk about net capital outflow, it's just asset, all right? So the assets such as purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents, it could including the foreign direct investment, such as in the United States. If you invest in other countries, that's the direct invest, right? Like if you want to buy a new plant or something like that, have a new factory in other countries. And the foreign portfolio investment is that's the indirect investment. If you buy the stocks, the bonds from other countries, that means you purchase foreign assets, right? So both of these two are it means the assets you have, which is the purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents. And except these two, usually if you have foreign currencies, usually it also means you have foreign assets, right? Because foreign currencies is not US dollars. If you have that money, you do not, such as euros. If you have euros, you do not invest that in European countries, or you do not want to use euros to buy European stocks and bonds. You just hold the currencies, euros. That still counts as you have the foreign asset. So usually foreign assets including these three parts. And outflow, it means you have this amount of stuff, this amount of assets. That means outflow, capital flow out, right? Because you need to use US dollars for these three things to invest. You need to give your US dollars to others in exchange for these three stuff. So that's the capital outflow, because the US dollars from you hands, Americans, to the other countries. So this part is the outflow. And this part is the inflow, the capital inflow, is the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners. If foreigners invested in the United States, so they are going to purchase US dollars to do this kind of stuff. The same, like they can have the direct investment in the United States, or they can buy the portfolio stuff in the United States, or they just want to hold the US dollars in their own hand. For these three terms or elements, that's the foreigners hold the domestic or the US asset. So that part, for this part, that's the capital inflow. Because they need US dollars for this stuff. So please distinguish these two. All in all, this equation is very important. Alright, the net capital outflow equals to purchase of foreign asset by domestic residents minus the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners. If the US dollars flow out, that's the outflow. If the US dollars flow in, that's inflow. But the net capital outflow, it should be the difference between these two. Again, when we talk about assets, it's not good on services, it's just assets. So net capital outflow measures the imbalance in a country's trade in assets. When NCO, net capital outflow, is bigger than zero, that means capital outflow. Because more US dollars go to other countries. That's the net outflow, right? Which means the domestic purchases of foreign assets exceed foreign purchases of domestic assets. When the net capital outflow is smaller than zero, then capital inflow, that's the capital inflow. Because more US dollars back into the US, fewer US dollars stay in other countries. So in this case, foreign purchase of domestic assets exceed domestic purchases of foreign assets. So for the capital outflow, since more US dollars in other countries, and you need to invest in other countries, more investment in other countries. And for capital inflow, other countries are going to invest in the United States. What variables could influence the net capital outflow? First of all, is the interest rate. It's kind of easier to understand. Like people prefer higher interest, higher revenue, right? Think about that. If the interest rate in the United States is higher, such as the highest interest rate around the world, which means the bonds interest rate, the stocks, returns, and others, they will be really high. In that case, for other countries, for the foreigners, they want to purchase the US bonds, right? Because the return in the US is higher than other countries. So if the interest rate in the United States is higher, then other countries are going to invest in the US. In that case, the net capital outflow is going to decrease. But if the real interest rate is higher in other countries, then all the people around the world is going to invest in that specific country because the returns is higher in that country. So in that case, Americans are going to invest in other countries instead of domestic investment, and the net capital outflow is going to increase in that way. Perceived economic and the political risk of holding foreign assets and the government policies for 3 and 4, they talk about the policy. So it's kind of the same as good, the trade, right? If the policy is stable, people are prefer to invest here because the fewer risk, which means a higher the stability of returns. But if the policy is unstable in that country, no people want to invest in those kind of countries. So because you don't know if you can get your money back because of the political instability. So 2 parts are the interest rate and the 2 parts are policies. The equality of net export and the net capital outflow. This equation is really important because these 2 terms should always equal to each other. Accounting identity, net capital outflow equals to net exports. Every transaction that affects net export also affects the net capital outflow by the same amount. Let's see one example. For example, if there are only 2 countries like for the US and China, only two countries trade with each other. We have exports. We have imports. Exports minus imports, that's the net export. And we also have foreign asset. We have domestic asset. So we also have net capital. For example, if US exports $500 million US dollars to China, which means China is going to import the same amount of US goods from the US, right? 500 million. That's the export amount from the US. But at the same time, US is also going to import some amount of goods and services from China, like imports $1,000 million from China, which means China is going to export $1,000 million to the US. US export is China's import. China's export is US import. So in this case, for the United States, the net export would be export minus import, negative $500 million, right? That's the US net export. For the China's net export is export minus import, that's $500 million net export for China. When we want to trade with goods and services with other countries, we need to use money, dollars, to buy those kind of stuff, right? So, which means if the US dollars is if US is going to export $500 to China, then which means the US is going to earn $500 million from China. So that's the US have the foreign asset. Is going to earn $500 million for this $500 million exports. At the same time, if the US is going to import $1,000 million from China, then the Americans are going to spend this $1,000 million, right, to China, and the asset. The money will go to China. And China will give you the goods and services. So for the domestic asset, if you import this amount of goods and services, your domestic asset is going to minus because you are going to pay this amount of money to China. Kind of the same logic for China. If China wants to export 1,000 millions of goods and services to America, then China is going to earn this amount of money from the US, right? So it's going to earn $1,000 million. That's foreign asset, that's US dollars China is going to earn from that export. But when China wants to import from the US, then China is going to pay that $500 million to the US to get the service and the goods. So if we have the foreign asset and domestic asset, some money flow out and some money flow in, we can plus these two numbers together for the US. The net capital outflow is negative $500 million. And for the China, 1,000 US dollars in, but $500 million out. So the net capital outflow would be positive $500 million. So you can see, just according to this example, you can see for the US, the net export -$500 million equals to the net capital outflow, which is still -$500 million. For China, the net export is positive $500 million. So the net capital outflow is again $500 million. So for these two terms, they should usually equal to each other. This is kind of easier to understand. Like if you want to have the goods and services, you have to pay the same amount of asset, right? So asset is equal, the value of asset is equal to the value of goods and services. So these two numbers should equal to each other. And net exports should equal to the net capital outflow. The international flow of goods and services and the international flow of capital are two sides of the same coin. Because you need to use good trade for asset or currencies, right? When a foreigner purchases good from the US, like China, if China wants to purchase good and service from the US, then US exports and net exports, because NX equals to export minus import, right? So if US exports, then NX will increase. The foreigners pay with currencies. This is the asset, right? Remember three elements for asset: the investment, the portfolio, including stock and the bonds, and the third one is kind of like currency. So the US acquires some foreign asset causing NCO to rise. That's the example I gave you in the blackboard. On the blackboard. So when US citizens buy foreign goods, like from China, then US imports rise. These imports rise, and the next net exports falls. And the US buyers pay the US dollars or assets. So the other countries acquire the US asset, causing the US NCO to fall. This is really important, so you should really understand this part. Let's do some question together. Example question. Remember, the equation of NCO is the foreign asset held by the United Citizens minus the domestic asset held by foreigners. That's the net capital outflow. So what happens to the net exports and net capital outflow according to different scenarios? For example, A. If A happens, then whatever will happen to NX and NCO. So which means purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents go up, right? Because that's American hold foreign asset. So the NCO should increase. Again, you need to remember this equation and you need to consider if something happened, what part increase? It's like the exports and the imports, like the example questions we learned before, right? You should consider if EX go up, go down, or imports go up, go down. The same logic as this one. When you see the sentence, you should figure out if residents hold a foreign asset or domestic hold foreign asset. So for A is NCO increase because domestic hold foreign asset. What about B? The same as the last one, right? As I said, the asset, it could be currency, like for A is currency. But for B is stocks or bonds, that's still asset, no difference. So B require foreign assets, so US NCO increase because the first element is going up. How about C? Oh, remember the net exports and the NCO, they equal to each other. If NCO go up, then net export of course go up because they usually equal to each other. If you want to have the good, you have to pay the value, the same value. So they should also always equal to each other. The first part is perfect. Shoes are good, not assets, which means NCO and the net exports do not change, right? So if a carrier sells something to other countries, in that way the export go up. But if she spends this same amount of money buy the goods from the other country, which means imports go up by the same amount, which means export go up, but import also go up. If they increase by the same amount, then net export doesn't change, and also the net capital outflow doesn't change either, because these two always equal to each other. So this is kind of tricky because it doesn't depend on anything. We have no further information. It depends on what the bank wants use that money for. If the banks want to use that money to buy some stuff, like whatever, to exchange dollars, I don't know. And different scenarios and different results will happen. So for D, it doesn't matter too much. Okay, how about this one? The Amazon US purchased these goods from China, and what's the effects? So the same logic as the last one, right? First of all, you should distinguish goods, services, or asset. And then distinguish if it's asset, if a domestic holds foreigner assets or foreigners hold domestic assets. How about A? If China buys this amount of the US bonds, what's the NCO would be? I think this is the same as the last one, right? The last one was 2 people, and this one is 2 countries. China is going to buy 10 million worth of US government bonds, right? That's the domestic asset, the US bonds, is held or purchased by China by foreigners. So if this one, the second term increase, NCO decrease. And also, you can take a look at C. China buys 10 million worth of stocks. Remember, for assets, it includes stocks and bonds. So technically, A and C, they are kind of the same questions. So for C, it's the same. How about B? For B, since the US imports increased and the US exports increased as well, then X, the net exports do not change, so NCO do not change either. For A and C, the same, so both of them decrease. For B, okay, next. A country running a trade surplus means NX is bigger than 0. Selling more goods and services to foreigners than is buying. Use the foreign currency it receives from the net sale of the good and services abroad to buy foreign assets. That's kind of like what I wrote on the blackboard, right? If you buy stuff, you should pay the money. And in that case, the capital is flowing out of the country, and the NCO is bigger than 0. In this case, it's kind of like means if you export more, and you are going to earn more foreign currencies, right? Earn more. If you have foreign currencies, you can, such as you have euros, you cannot use it in United States. You have to use it in other countries. How do you use? Usually, you can only use your euros in European countries, in which you are going to invest in other countries more. More, right? So if you export more, which means your net exports go up, and you have money, you have to invest it, but you cannot invest it in the United States. In the United States, you have to use US dollars. So with the foreign currencies, you can only invest it in buy their stocks and whatever bonds, and then your net capital outflow will go up. Because you, as a resident, hold more foreign assets. And this is the same for this one, but opposite. Country is running a trade deficit, which means buying more goods and services from foreigners than is selling to them, and financing the net purchase of these goods and services in world market by selling assets abroad. So capital is flowing into the country. Kind of the same logic, right, here. If imports go up, which means you are going to pay some money. If other countries get you money, get you currencies like US dollars, they cannot spend that in their own country. They have to use that US dollars invest in the United States. So in the United States is invested. So if United States is invested, which means foreigners hold some domestic asset, and NCO is smaller than zero. Saving and investment. Remember, we have learned the closed economy. For closed economy, savings equal to y minus t minus c plus t minus g equals to private savings plus public savings. And also in the closed economy, we learned that saving equals to investment. Because in the closed economy, we assume that net export equal to zero, no import, no export. This is what we learned before, right? But in this chapter, we are going to learn the open economy, which means the net export is not equal to zero. We have imports, we have exports. But again, the national saving is the same, equals to y minus c minus g. The product we produced within the country minus the stuff we need to consume within the country, and that's the national saving. So which means y minus, if we change c and g's position to the left-hand side, for this equation we can get y minus c minus g equals to investment plus the net export. The net export. And s equals to this term, so we change s with this one, we get s equals to I plus nx. Since nx, net export, is always equals to the net capital outflow, because that's the two sides of the coin, right? If you want to get the food, if you want to get the goods, you have to pay the money. That's the fair trade. So these two should always equal to each other. In that way, we can get S equals to I plus NCO, which means saving equals to domestic investment plus net capital outflows. In the closed economy, we learned that saving equals to investment because no net export. But in open economy, if we have net exports, of course we have money or currency flow in and flow out. That's the net capital outflow. So that's the economy, open economy. So in this case, since the saving equals to domestic investment plus net capital outflow, which means what if S is bigger than I? So if S is bigger than bigger than I, then ICO is bigger than zero, right? Because this equation should always equal to each other. If S is bigger than I, then NCO should be bigger than zero. In that case, which means Americans have more savings, they need to invest in other countries. people should use saving to invest. If American saving is higher than domestic investment, then the actual saving have to invest in other countries. In that case, net capital outflow is bigger than zero. On the other hand, is if S is smaller than I, then NCO is smaller than zero. If we want to hold this equation equal to each other, only when the NCO is smaller than zero, S could be smaller than I, which means, such as just in the United States, if the United States do not have enough saving to invest what Americans need, then it has to maybe borrow or attract other countries, attract foreigners to invest in the United States. In that case, the net capital outflow is going to be smaller than zero. In the last slide, we have S equal to I plus NCO, and if we change the position between S and NCO, we can get NCO is equal to S minus I. And if trade surplus happen, which means exports is bigger than imports, then export minus imports is bigger than zero. And for Y, remember Y equals to C plus I plus G plus NX. If NX is bigger than zero, then Y should be bigger than this one, because this term is bigger than zero. If this term is bigger than zero, then S is, which means if this term is bigger than zero, then NCO bigger than zero, then S is bigger than I. And the same, if trade deficit happens, exports is smaller than imports, and the net exports is smaller than zero. And the same reason. So this happens. Basically, again, if S is bigger than I, which means you are going to earn some foreign currencies. Foreign G. With foreign currencies, you should invest in other countries. And if S is smaller than I, you are going to pay foreign countries. And for foreign countries with the US dollars, they have to invest in the United States. I think it's kind of easy, right? If the net export is bigger than zero, which exports more, you earn money. If net export is smaller than zero, which means you import more, the net import is bigger, then you pay for countries, and they are going to invest in your country. This is smaller than zero, bigger than zero. This is the data for the United States of saving and investment from 1950 to 2019. Blue line is the investment, but also is the private domestic investment. And the saving is the red line. So we calculate the NCO is equal to S minus I. So the red line minus the blue line, that's the net capital outflow. So we can see when or before this period of 1982, around 1982, when savings equal investment, and so we can see the NCO, the net capital outflow, is almost equal to zero. But after this period, the saving is smaller than investment, more investment in the US. But for United States, you do not save enough, which means the net capital outflow is smaller than zero, it's negative. This is zero, then the NCO is smaller than zero, which means other countries is going to invest or already invest in the United States. Largest negative value happens around 2006 6 or 7 time period. It's getting smaller recently. Nominal exchange rate, the rate at which one country's currency trade for another. And again, for the open economy, why you want to buy some stuff from other countries? Usually because the relative price is cheaper in that country, right? And when we talk about the price, we usually need the nominal exchange rate. So that's the reason why this is another important element in this chapter. We express our exchange rates as foreign currencies per unit of domestic currency, such as this one. And always, it should be per US dollars. If you use $1 US, how many amount of other currencies you can have? That's the exchange rate. So for Canadian dollars, if you have $1 US, you can trade for 1.25 the Canadian dollars. For euros, the Japanese yen, the Mexican peso. So again, that's worth, this amount of other currencies worth $1 US. If the value is getting bigger, it's getting big, what does it mean? Well, it means, remember, the number, it means if you use $1 US, you can exchange for this amount of foreign currencies. If this number gets big, which means you use the same amount of $1 US, you can have a larger number of the foreign currencies. In that case, which means the US dollars has a higher value or appreciate. There is an appreciation in the US dollars if the number goes up, if the number goes down, which means the depreciation for the US dollars, because this number means $1 US could exchange for. So here, appreciation, increase in the value of currency. So as measured by the amount of foreign currencies it can buy, such as $1 US can buy how many foreign currency. Depreciation or weakening, decrease in the value of foreign currency, as measured by the amount of foreign currencies it can buy. For example, in this question, A is US dollar. I ask US dollar appreciate or depreciate? Because you can buy more, right? From 100 to 105. And B is kind of the same. From 25 to 20, which means you can buy fewer foreign currencies, which means the US dollar depreciation. So that's this example question. If you can buy more, which means the value of your currency is increased, so that's appreciation. If you can buy fewer, that's depreciation. The real exchange rate. Remember the real, when we talk about the real, usually we do not have the unit, the dollars, the euros, no figures, no unit. Just to compare with the real goods and services. So the real exchange rate is the same, the rate at which the goods and services of one country trade for the goods and services of another. This expression is, or formula is important. Please write it down and remember it. The real exchange rate equals to E times P. This P in the numerator is the domestic price. So the P is domestic price. And divided by P star. P star is the foreign price. So please do not distinguish these two positions. The numerator is domestic. The denominator is foreign price. And the E is the nominal exchange rate, the foreign currency per unit of domestic. In the United States, it's usually per dollar. $1 US, how many other currencies you can exchange for. So this equation is very important, all right? What's the real exchange rate? Plug in the numbers. The exchange rate is 110. Also plug in different price pair. The domestic is US dollars, and and the denominator is foreign currency here, or foreign price. So the result is exactly the same as this one, right? So what's the price of US latte? In this one, if you want to calculate how many pesos you need to pay for the US latte, so you need to use E times P. Because this E is how many foreign currencies worth one US dollar, right? So that's 20 pesos per dollar. And times P, the price in the United States, that's $3 per latte. If you times these two, you will get 60 pesos. Pesos per latte, right? That's the prices in the US latte measured in pesos. And B, calculate the real exchange rate measured as Mexican latte per US latte. This is the result. E times the numerator is the price in domestic. The P star, the denominator, is the price in foreign currency. So the result is 1.5 Mexican lattes per US latte. Remember, for real exchange rate, there is no currency there, no nominal figure, just how many products equal to another. We talk about quantity for the real value or the real variable. So again, real exchange rate equals to this term. Again, very important, and the price of a domestic basket of goods relative to the price of foreign basket of goods. So we cancel out the price, the unit term. We leave how many goods. The term is just the basket of goods. And P is the US price level, domestic. P star is the foreign price level. If US real exchange rate appreciate, which means US goods become more expensive relative to foreign goods. That's the real exchange rate. In last example, like in this one, if the real exchange rate is 1.5 Mexican latte per US latte, then what's the depreciation means? Depreciation means E is going to decrease of US dollars, right? Remember, for E, the exchange rate is $1 worth how much of foreign currencies. If E decrease, which means there is a fall of US dollars. For the same amount of US dollars, you can only buy fewer foreign currencies, which means the price for the United States or the product in the United States is going to be cheaper, which means going to buy more US goods and buy fewer products from others. So which means for United States, the exports and the US is USD is kind of, if E decrease means depreciation, which means USD depreciation with means the US goods is going to be cheaper. So the exports for the United States is going to increase, and imports for the United States is going to decrease, which means the net export is going to increase. So that's when the exchange rate change. For US dollars, if US dollars depreciation or fall, then the net export should increase. That's the reason why we should remember or understand the exchange rate. And the opposite, if the exchange rate or the US dollars appreciate, then the US goods comparative with other goods is more expensive. In that way, the exports is going to decrease, the imports is going to increase, and the net exports is going to decrease. So that's the relationship between the exchange rate and the net export. And since the net export is equal to the NCO, so that's the relationship between exchange rate and these two terms. All right. Purchasing power parity, a theory of exchange rate whereby a unit of any given currency should be able to buy the same quantity of goods in all countries. And based on the law of one price, a good should sell for the same price in all locations. That's the definition of purchasing power parity, because they assume that for the same stuff, the price should be the same. Like for the Big Mac in the United States sell like $2, and they should be the same price as $2 in other countries. But because of the different exchange rate, the nominal figure could be different. But the real exchange rate should be the same. That's the purchasing power parity. Why? Because there is a term called arbitrage, which means take the advantage of price differences for the same item in different markets. A unit of currency must have the same value in every country. Example question. If the coffee beans sell for $4 a pound in Seattle and $5 a pound in Boston, and the coffee beans can be costlessly transported, this is very important, which means the transportation cost is equal to zero. The how will two markets reach equilibrium? And that's explain the purchasing power parity. Why the price should be the same in different areas. Because the opportunity cost for arbitrage making a quick profit by buying coffee in Seattle and selling it in Boston. Because the transportation cost is equal to zero. And in that way, more consumption in the Seattle, then more demand in Seattle will drive the price in Seattle's coffee beans go up. And they are going to sell the product from Seattle to Boston. If more supply in Boston, then the price of coffee beans in Boston will decrease until the price are equal. So that's the reason why the purchasing power parity emerged. Okay, using this theory, which means the price in two different areas, the price of the product should be the same. So use this theory and calculate the exchange rate here. What's the nominal exchange rate? If the real exchange rate should be the same in different areas. So what's the nominal exchange rate here? The nominal exchange rate, remember, is how much of foreign currency is worth $1 US. This is nominal. When we talk about nominal, it's usually the denominator is per USD, right? That's the nominal exchange rate. Equals to the denominator should be USD, and then the numerator should be foreign currencies. And $30. That equals to 10 krona per USD. That's how you calculate the exchange rate if purchasing power parity really happens. Equals to 10. The implication of purchasing power parity, if purchasing power of dollar is always the same at home and abroad, then the real exchange rate cannot change, which means one US latte equals to one Mexican latte, something like that. The real exchange rate will not change. So the only thing will change the nominal exchange rate is the price level. So the theory of purchasing power parity equals this one. E equals to the price. Remember, since the exchange rate, the denominator is always the US dollars, so P here for the exchange rate is in denominator. For numerator is the foreign price. Foreign price divided by the domestic or the US dollars, that's the exchange rate. So that's the theory of purchasing power parity. Nominal exchange rate between the currency of two countries must reflect the price level in those two countries. So again, P domestic, P star foreign, and the E is usually per US dollars. You should put P in denominator again. So we use the PPP to calculate the exchange rate or the nominal exchange rate. Use this formula. So the nominal exchange rate change only when the price level change. What will cause the price level change? Well, usually the money supply or inflation. So when a central bank in any country increases the money supply, that will cause the price level to rise, and it also causes the country's currency to depreciate relative to other currencies in the world. If another country's currency depreciate, which means with the US dollars you can buy more another currencies, which means the figure of the exchange rate will increase. And also, that means the depreciation for foreign currencies, but appreciation for the US dollars. If two countries have different inflation rates, then E, the nominal exchange rate, will change over time. However, we also have some limitations of the purchasing power parity. Theory of purchasing power parity doesn't always hold in practice, because many goods are not easily traded. Price differences on such goods cannot be arbitraged away. Because when we talk about arbitrage, we assume that transportation fee, the cost of transportation equal to zero. But in the reality, the transportation fee is not zero. So which means the arbitrage is not easy. That's the first reason why PPP cannot hold. And another reason is even tradable goods are not always perfect substitutes when they are produced in different countries, because price differences reflect taste differences. For example, like Americans, just for example, Americans like big cars. And for Japanese, they like small cars. What does that mean? It means the big cars in the United States should worth more, should sell more amount of dollars compared with Japanese, right? And in Japan, the small cars should be more expensive relative to the small cars in the America. So that's what the price difference reflect the different reflect the taste differences. So because of these two, the PPP usually doesn't work. So purchasing power parity, not a perfect theory of exchange rate determination. So just because of these two reasons, usually we cannot use or calculate E with P star divided by P. So this is not a good determination. All right. And the real also real exchange rate fluctuate over time because of people's taste maybe change, and the real exchange rate will also change over time. Large and persistent movements in nominal exchange rate typically reflect a change in price level at home and abroad. So if a country's inflation rate is higher, which means the faster the currency should depreciation. And depreciation. If the inflation rate is higher, then deflation will faster. Nominal exchange rate reflects inflation. So according to this picture, we can see that there was a hyperinflation in Germany from 1921 to 1922. The money supply will cause inflation, right? If money supply is higher, which means the price level, the inflation will be higher. So usually these two lines are the same. So if the price level is higher, which means the inflation is high, then exchange rate depreciate, right? Like what I wrote in the last slide. When inflation is higher or inflation rate is higher, then the deflation will, or the deflate will faster. That's what this picture tells us. And that's the real data, and it's the same as our understanding from our theory. The exchange rate also reflects the inflation, not the real exchange rate, and that's the limitation of PPP. Alright, that's all the materials I want to talk in this